In 1966, a man who weighed 135 pounds soaking wet walked into the most exclusive nightclub in Hong Kong, a place where triads sat in velvet booths and British diplomats pretended not to notice them. And when a 6'8" doorman put a hand on his chest and told him the VIP section was full, this man didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, didn't even blink. He just stood there. 4 seconds later, the club owner came sprinting across the floor so fast he knocked a drink out of a waitress's hand. And what he said to that bouncer would become one of the most quietly legendary moments in martial arts history. But we'll get to that. Because to understand why a nightclub owner would nearly break his own ankle running across a dance floor for a man who stood 5'7" and looked like he could be knocked over by a stiff breeze, you need to understand something most people never learn about Bruce Lee. Something that had nothing to do with his fists. See, the Bruce Lee most people know is the one from the posters, the one with the scratches across his chest, the nunchucks, the yellow jumpsuit. That Bruce Lee is a character, a product, a myth buffed and polished by 40 years of Hollywood marketing and kung fu movie marathons on basic cable. And that myth, as powerful as it is, actually hides the real story. Because the real Bruce Lee, the one who existed before the cameras and the magazine covers, was something far stranger, far more dangerous, and far more human than any movie ever captured. He was a man who could strike you from 3 inches away with enough force to send you stumbling backward across a room. He was a man who once broke a heavy bag designed to withstand the kicks of professional Muay Thai fighters, not with a kick, but with a punch that weighed less than the bag itself. He was also a man who got into street fights as a teenager, who was told he'd never make it in America because of the color of his skin, and who carried a chip on his shoulder the size of Hong Kong Island itself. And in the spring of 1966, he was about to prove something in a nightclub that no amount of film footage could ever fully convey. But first, you need to understand the Hong Kong that Bruce Lee walked back into that year, because it was not the Hong Kong he had left behind. When Bruce departed for Seattle in 1959 at the age of 18, his father had practically shoved him onto the boat. The kid had been getting into too many rooftop fights with rival school students, and the Lee family, despite their prominence in Cantonese opera, was running out of favors with local police. Bruce had already been in a formal boxing match at St. Francis Xavier's College where he'd beaten the reigning 3-year champion, a British kid named Gary Elms, using a Wing Chun technique that nobody in the ring recognized. He was talented. He was also reckless. And in late 50s Hong Kong, reckless got you killed or arrested, sometimes both on the same night. So off he went to America. And what happened over the next 7 years transformed him from a scrappy street kid into something the world had genuinely never seen before. In Seattle, he enrolled at the University of Washington, studied philosophy, opened a tiny martial arts school in a parking garage, and started doing something no traditional martial artist had ever done. He started questioning everything. He studied fencing footwork under a professor named James DeMille. He analyzed the boxing mechanics of Muhammad Ali, rewinding fight footage frame by frame until his projector bulb burned out. He borrowed principles from Western wrestling, from Filipino Kali stick fighting, from French savate. And he threw away everything that didn't work. Not some of it. Everything. He tossed out entire kata systems that had been passed down for centuries if he couldn't find a practical use for them in a real fight. This was heresy. Absolute heresy. The traditional martial arts community in San Francisco's Chinatown wanted him disciplined or silenced. Some wanted worse. But Bruce didn't care. He was building something. By 1964, he had developed what he called a style of no style, a fluid, adaptive combat system that would eventually become known as Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist. And when he demonstrated it at the Long Beach International Karate Championships that year, performing his famous 1-inch punch on a volunteer who flew backward into a chair so hard it broke, the martial arts world split in half. One half said he was a genius. The other half said he was a fraud. The truth, as always, was more interesting than either side admitted. And then came the fight that changed everything. In late 1964, a traditional kung fu master named Wong Jack Man challenged Bruce to a private fight in the back of a San Francisco martial arts school. The exact details remain disputed to this day, but what is agreed upon by nearly everyone who was present is this. The fight lasted approximately 3 minutes, Bruce won, and he was furious afterward. Not because of the fight itself, because it had taken him 3 minutes. 3 minutes was an eternity to a man who believed a real fight should last seconds. He told his wife Linda that night that he had been too slow, too winded, too reliant on chasing his opponent around the room. That dissatisfaction, that refusal to accept a victory that didn't meet his own impossible standard, sent him into a period of obsessive physical refinement that bordered on the monastic. He began running 6 miles a day in under 42 minutes. He developed an ab workout so punishing that his training partners refused to attempt it. He started measuring his own strike speed using a modified stroboscopic camera borrowed from a physics lab at UCLA, one of the first martial artists in history to use scientific instrumentation to quantify combat performance. By 1965, he had reduced his hand strike initiation time to 0.05 of a second. That's 50 milliseconds. A housefly can react in 30. Bruce Lee was nearly as fast as an insect, and he hit considerably harder. Now here's where the nightclub story begins to take shape, because when Bruce returned to Hong Kong in early 1966, he wasn't coming back as a movie star. Not yet. The Green Hornet wouldn't premiere on ABC until September of that year. He was coming back as something arguably more dangerous in Hong Kong's social hierarchy. He was coming back as a man with a reputation. And in Hong Kong in the mid-60s, reputation was currency that could buy you things money couldn't. Word had already filtered back across the Pacific through letters, phone calls, and the whispered networks of the Chinese diaspora. The kid who left Hong Kong as a teenage street fighter had become something else in America, something that didn't have a name yet. People in the martial arts world talked about him the way physicists talk about a new element, with a mixture of excitement and unease, the sense that existing categories might not apply. His old Wing Chun teacher, Ip Man, had reportedly been shown a clip of the Long Beach demonstration and watched it twice without speaking. When asked what he thought, the old master simply said, "He has gone his own way." Coming from Ip Man, a man who measured words the way a jeweler measures diamonds, this was either the highest praise or a quiet disownment. It might have been both. The club was called the Bayside, and it sat on the edge of Tsim Sha Tsui, the glittering nightlife strip on Kowloon's southern tip, where neon signs in Cantonese and English flickered above doorways that led into smoke-filled rooms with live jazz bands and hostesses in cheongsam dresses. The Bayside was not a place for tourists. It was a place where film producers closed deals over whiskey, where off-duty police captains played mahjong in back rooms, and where the line between legitimate business and triad influence was so blurred it might as well not have existed. Getting into the VIP section of the Bayside meant you were somebody. Getting turned away meant you were nobody. And on this particular night, a bouncer named Ko Kyung, who stood 6 feet 8 inches tall and weighed roughly 260 pounds, had just told Bruce Lee he was nobody. Now you need to picture Ko Kyung for a moment because this detail matters. 6'8" in Hong Kong in 1966 was not just tall. It was spectacle. In a city where the average male height was approximately 5'4", Ko Kyung would have looked like he belonged in a different species. He had played amateur basketball. He had worked security at the Star Ferry terminal before moving to nightclub doors. His hands, according to one account from a regular at the Bayside, were large enough to wrap entirely around a pint glass with his fingers overlapping. And he had a simple rule at the velvet rope. If he didn't know your face, you didn't pass. No exceptions. Bruce approached with 2 friends, one of whom was a young stuntman named Unicorn Chan, who would later appear in several of Bruce's films. They were dressed well, but not extravagantly. Bruce wore a dark-fitted jacket, slim trousers, and the kind of quiet confidence that either reads as class or as trouble, depending on who's observing. When Ko Kyung extended his arm across the entrance to the VIP section and told them the area was reserved, Bruce simply said in Cantonese, "I understand. Would you check with the owner?" His voice was calm, almost gentle. But here's what happened in the space between that request and the owner's arrival, and this is the part most retellings leave out. Ko Kyung didn't just refuse. He laughed. He turned to another doorman and said something dismissive, something along the lines of calling Bruce a little movie boy, a term that in Cantonese carried a specific kind of contempt, implying someone who was all performance and no substance. And Bruce heard it. He absolutely heard it. Unicorn Chan later said he saw something shift in Bruce's eyes in that moment, a stillness that settled over his face like a mask being lowered into place. Not anger, something colder, something more patient. And then the owner appeared. His name was David Leung, and he had been in his office on the second floor when someone on his staff ran upstairs and told him that Bruce Lee was standing at the VIP rope. David Leung did not walk downstairs. He ran. He came down a narrow back staircase so fast that when he burst through the side door onto the main floor, he collided with a waitress carrying a tray of cocktails and sent a gin and tonic sailing into the lap of a man who, by some accounts, was a mid-ranking officer in the 14K triad. Leung didn't stop. He didn't apologize. He crossed 40 feet of dance floor in what witnesses later estimated was about 4 seconds, which is an extraordinary pace for a man in leather-soled dress shoes on a polished hardwood floor. When he reached the VIP entrance, he was out of breath. He looked at Ko Kyung with an expression that one witness described as a mixture of fury and terror, the kind of look a man gives when he realizes his employee has just insulted the one person in the building who should never be insulted. And what he said next, has been repeated by people who were there that night with slight variations, but always the same core message. He grabbed Ko Kyung by the arm, pulled him aside, and said something close to, "Do you have any idea who that is? That man could kill every person in this room, and there is nothing you or I or anyone else could do to stop him. Now move." That's a remarkable thing for a nightclub owner to say about a 135-pound man. Remarkable and worth examining. But here's what made David Leung say that, and this is where the story goes deeper. Because Leung hadn't just heard of Bruce Lee, he had seen him. Specifically, he had been present at a private demonstration that Bruce had given 3 weeks earlier at a gymnasium in Kowloon, a demonstration organized by a mutual friend who thought it would be good for Bruce to reintroduce himself to Hong Kong's power brokers before the Green Hornet aired. At that demonstration, Bruce did things that the 12 men watching had never seen a human body do. He performed a sidekick on a training pad held by a man who weighed over 200 pounds, a man who was bracing with both arms and leaning into the impact, and the force drove the man backward so fast that he hit a concrete wall 8 feet behind him and cracked the plaster. Bruce then demonstrated his hand speed by having a volunteer hold a coin in an open palm, telling the volunteer to close his fist the instant he felt Bruce move, and then snatching the coin before the fist could close, replacing it with a different coin. He did this 4 times in a row. The volunteer, a former amateur boxer, couldn't close his hand fast enough, not once. But here's what terrified David Leung most. It wasn't the power, it wasn't the speed, it was the control. Because at the end of the demonstration, Bruce had a volunteer stand perfectly still while he threw a full-speed punch that stopped less than a quarter inch from the man's nose. The volunteer, who had agreed to stand still, flinched so hard he fell backward over a bench. Bruce hadn't touched him. The air displacement from the punch had made the man's eyes water, and Bruce just smiled and bowed. That's the part that David Leung couldn't get out of his head. The smile. The absolute calm certainty of a man who knew exactly what his body could do and chose, every single second, not to do it. So when Ko Kyung made his dismissive little comment about the little movie boy, he was standing 3 feet from someone who could have restructured his skeletal system before his nervous system registered the first impact. He just didn't know it. After the owner's intervention, Bruce was escorted to the best booth in the VIP section, a curved leather banquette against the back wall with a direct sight line to the stage. Drinks appeared without being ordered. The band, reportedly, played a Cantonese jazz number that Bruce's father, Li Hoi Chuen, had been famous for performing in the 1940s. Whether this was coincidence or a deliberate gesture by the owner remains unclear. What is clear is that Bruce sat in that booth for approximately 2 hours, drinking tea, not alcohol, and speaking quietly with a rotating cast of people who came to pay their respects. And here's the detail that almost nobody talks about, the one that reveals something deeper about who Bruce Lee actually was as a man, the part of the story that never makes it into the documentaries or the tribute reels. Sometime during the evening, Ko Kyung came to the booth. Not to apologize exactly. According to Unicorn Chan, the big man just stood at the edge of the table with his hands folded in front of him, looking uncomfortable in the way that very large men sometimes look when they realize their size is irrelevant. He smelled like cigarette smoke and the cheap cologne that bouncers in Tsim Sha Tsui wore like armor. His shoulders, which were broad enough to partially block the doorframe behind him, were hunched slightly, contracted, as though his body was trying to make itself smaller for the first time in his adult life. And Bruce stood up. He stood up from the best booth in the VIP section of a club where triad lieutenants held court, and he extended his hand to the man who had laughed at him 30 minutes earlier, and he said in Cantonese something close to, "You were doing your job. Never apologize for doing your job well." Then he invited Ko Kyung to sit. The 6'8" bouncer and the 5'7" martial artist sat in the same VIP booth for 20 minutes, talking about, of all things, basketball. Chan said Bruce asked Ko Kyung about his playing days, asked about his footwork, asked whether he'd ever considered that lateral movement in basketball and lateral evasion in fighting operated on the same mechanical principles. Ko Kyung, who had probably never had a conversation like this in his life, was apparently so disarmed that he forgot he was supposed to be working the door. That moment right there. That's the Bruce Lee that the movies can't capture. Because the movies show you a man who could fight. But they can never quite show you the man who chose not to, who turned a moment of potential humiliation into a gesture of grace, who understood that real power has nothing to prove. But the nightclub incident wasn't an isolated moment. It was part of a pattern that followed Bruce Lee through every phase of his life, a pattern of people underestimating him based on his size and then discovering, sometimes gently and sometimes not, that they had made a catastrophic miscalculation. Take the incident on the set of Enter the Dragon in 1973, just months before his death. An extra, a trained martial artist who had been hired for a fight scene, decided during a break in filming that he wanted to test whether Bruce was really as fast as everyone claimed. He walked up to Bruce on set and threw a jab at him without warning, a real jab, fast and committed. What happened next was captured by the set photographer and described by several crew members. Bruce didn't block the punch. He didn't parry it. He intercepted the man's arm mid-extension, redirected it, and placed the man in a standing wrist lock so quickly that the extra was on his knees before anyone watching understood what had happened. The entire exchange lasted less than a second. Bruce helped the man up, patted him on the shoulder, and went back to eating his lunch. No anger, no lecture. Just a quiet, physical statement of fact. Or consider the famous sparring session with Vic Moore in 1967 at the Washington, D.C. karate tournament. Moore was a nationally ranked point fighter, tall, fast, and confident. Bruce told him he was going to throw a straight lead punch to his face, told him exactly what was coming, and invited Moore to block it. Moore couldn't. Bruce tagged him clean 7 times in a row. Moore later said in an interview that it was like trying to block a phone call. You know it's coming, you can hear it ringing, but somehow the connection is made before your hand reaches the receiver. And then there's a story that almost never gets told, one that a former student of Bruce's named Herb Jackson shared privately at a martial arts gathering in Oakland in 1989, years after Bruce's death. Jackson was the man who designed and built many of Bruce's custom training devices, including his modified wooden dummy and his spring-loaded striking platform. According to Jackson, there was an evening in 1968 when Bruce was training alone in his garage gym on Bel Air Place in Los Angeles, working through a series of explosive drills at full speed. Jackson had arrived early for a scheduled session and stood watching through the garage window for nearly a full minute without Bruce noticing, which was itself extraordinary because Bruce noticed everything. What Jackson saw in that unguarded minute was, in his words, not something he could reconcile with normal human movement. Bruce was throwing combinations at a heavy bag mounted on a ceiling chain, and the bag, which weighed 150 pounds, was swinging so violently that the ceiling mount was groaning and shedding plaster dust. But it wasn't the power that stopped Jackson cold. It was the sound. Or rather, the absence of it. Bruce's feet made no noise on the concrete floor. None. A 135-pound man throwing full-power strikes with enough rotational force to nearly tear a bag from its mount, and his footwork was silent. Jackson said he stood there and felt something he could only describe as a kind of awe that verged on dread, the feeling of watching something that shouldn't be possible and knowing it was absolutely real. He never told that story publicly during his lifetime. He said it felt too private, like he had accidentally witnessed something sacred. These moments, the bouncer, the extra, the tournament fighter, the silent feet on the concrete floor, they all point to the same reality that David Leung grasped in that Kowloon gymnasium and that Ko Kyung learned in the VIP section of the Bayside. Bruce Lee existed at a speed that the human nervous system was not designed to counter. Research conducted years later at the California Institute for Human Performance estimated that his punching speed from a standing start was approximately 44.5 miles per hour, with a hand retraction speed that was actually faster than his extension, meaning he could hit you and pull his fist back before your brain processed the initial strike. His reaction time, measured in a separate study, was approximately 54 milliseconds. The average human reaction time is 250 milliseconds. He was operating in a temporal window that most people's nervous systems couldn't even perceive, let alone respond to. But speed alone doesn't explain the fear in David Leung's eyes. What explains the fear is what Bruce did with that speed. Because Bruce Lee didn't just move fast, he moved with intent. Every technique was designed not to score points, not to perform, but to end a confrontation instantly and completely. His sidekick generated an estimated 950 pounds of force. His 1-inch punch delivered 150 pounds of pressure into a surface area roughly the size of a golf ball. And he could deliver both from a resting position with no visible wind-up, no telegraph, no warning. He was, in a very real biomechanical sense, a weapon that looked like a philosophy student. This is what makes the nightclub story so fascinating. Because in that moment at the velvet rope, two worlds collided. There was the visible world, where a small man in a fitted jacket was being dismissed by a very large man at a doorway. And then there was the invisible world, the world that David Leung had glimpsed in that gymnasium, where the small man was carrying in his compact frame a capacity for violence so refined and so controlled that it had become something closer to art than to aggression. Ko Kyung saw the surface. Leung had seen beneath it. And the distance between those two perceptions was the distance between a man doing his job and a man sprinting across a dance floor in 4 seconds flat. Years later, after Bruce Lee's death in 1973, at the devastating age of 32, a journalist tracked down Ko Kyung for an interview about that night. The big man was retired by then, living quietly in the new territories. He said he had thought about that evening many times over the years. He said the thing he remembered most wasn't the owner's panic or the VIP treatment or even the revelation of who the small man really was. What he remembered most was the handshake. The moment Bruce stood up and extended his hand and told him never to apologize for doing his job. He said Bruce's grip was the strangest thing he had ever felt. Not crushing, not aggressive, but alive somehow. As if there were currents running beneath the skin that ordinary people didn't possess. He said it felt like shaking hands with a power line. And then he said something that might be the most honest thing anyone has ever said about Bruce Lee. "I've been a bouncer for 20 years, he said. I've met gangsters, I've met soldiers, I've met men who killed people with their hands. They all felt different when you shook their hands. Hard, tense, something coiled up inside. His hand didn't feel like that. His hand felt calm, and that's what scared me. Because the dangerous ones, the really dangerous ones, they're never tense. They've already decided what they can do. They're just waiting to see if they have to. That's the Bruce Lee who walked into the Bayside that night in 1966. Not a movie star, not a showman. A man who had already decided what he could do and was simply waiting to see if the world required it of him. A man who weighed 135 pounds and could have reshaped the interior of that nightclub in ways that would have required structural renovation, and instead chose to drink tea, talk about basketball with a 6'8" bouncer, and listen to the kind of jazz his father used to sing. And when you understand that, when you understand that the real Bruce Lee was not the flying kick, or the battle cry, or the scratched chest, but the calm hand and the quiet voice and the tea instead of whiskey, then you understand something the movies have been trying to tell you for 50 years and have never quite managed. The most dangerous man in the room is never the one who's trying to prove it. He's the one sipping tea in the back booth, smiling, remembering his father's music and letting the bouncer keep his dignity. That's power. And Bruce Lee had more of it than any room could hold.